Hello and welcome to Season 3, Episode 4 of the Squeaky Wheel podcast. We speak with leading influencers about policy, industry and more across cycling, walking and all other forms of human-scaled mobility. My name is Phil Latz and I've been squeaking about various causes for over 40 years.
Hi, I'm Sarah Stace, Director of Cities at Vivendi Cities, joining today from Gadigal Land in Sydney.
And good news, I'm thrilled to announce that Sarah is coming on board in an ongoing capacity as co-host of the Squeaky Wheel podcast. Welcome, Sarah. I'm so glad that you accepted my invitation to come on board.
I'm super excited to be joining you, Phil. And before we introduce you to this month's guest, we'd greatly appreciate it if you could subscribe via your podcast platform of choice and leave us a rating. Thank you for your support.
This month our guest is Paul Walsh, CEO of the newly created lobby group European Cycling Industries, which, as we'll go into in more detail during our conversation, actually has roots going back decades because it was recently formed through the merger of two previously separate organisations. Paul is an Irishman who lives in Brussels, the home of the European Parliament and European Commission. Paul has a master's degree in association management. Before entering cycling advocacy, Paul worked across a wide range of sectors, including aviation, research and innovation, tourism, and medical devices. Paul Walsh, welcome to the Squeaky Wheel podcast.
Thanks, Phil. I'm very happy to be here.
I'm just going to dive in with some questions. Paul, it sounds like you have an Irish accent, so I'm guessing you're born in Ireland, but apparently you now live in Brussels. So what prompted the move?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. That was over 20 years ago. I was studying philosophy in Dublin and I wanted to pursue an academic career, and my professors there told me you should get some international experience, and they recommended Belgium. And I had met a Belgian guy on a previous international trip and he was singing the praises of a town called Leuven, and that's where the university was, and so it all seemed to come together, and I moved to Belgium. As well, I think it was the European international experience that really changed things for me. So we have this Erasmus program concept in Europe. That's where it's an exchange program for universities. So I did that when I was 20. Before that, I had only really known Irish people, but on this international exchange, I met Finnish people and Croatian people and Swiss people, and I really enjoyed that. So I came back to Ireland, and when I was back in Ireland, I was really eager for an opportunity to leave again, and the opportunity to leave to Belgium came up, so I went for it.
And when was that? When did you move permanently?
2005.
Okay, so quite some time.
Yeah, it goes very fast.
I can imagine. Often cycling organisation workers and leaders are lifelong bike industry veterans, whereas you've worked in diverse fields, including most recently in aviation. What motivated you to move from that much larger industry to the world of bicycles?
Yeah, so I've been working in associations for the past 10 or so years in different sectors, and I'm really interested in how to run associations professionally, and that's the type of career I'm trying to build for myself. I was working as a staff member of an aviation association, and I really wanted the opportunity to run an association. And a headhunter contacted me with the opportunity for Cycling Industries Europe. I went through the interview process and got the job. So it wasn't a conscious decision on my part, oh, I'm fed up with aviation, I want to get into cycling. It's just an opportunity that very fortunately for me came my way.
And were you already a mad keen biker?
Not at all. I was somebody who would cycle maybe once every 2 months.
All right, well, that's quite a change then. And what differences have you noticed? It's been about a year since you moved industries. What are the key differences that you've noticed?
I've noticed more similarities than differences. So I was working in the private aviation industry, and this is an industry that's quite fragmented, lots of small companies, a lot of people who can only see themselves working in aviation, people whose parents worked in aviation, whose grandparents worked in aviation. And so I think it's quite similar in the cycling industry that there are so many people who are just absolutely dedicated, passionate about cycling and couldn't see themselves doing anything else. And also the fact that in cycling it's quite fragmented industry as well, and so much depends on relationships and being part of the community. All of this part of it seems very similar. One thing that's different for me is that I was working in private aviation, and that's a difficult area to lobby for. At that particular organization, we were not able to publicize the locations for our events because protesters would show up and try to disrupt the events, and we encountered many closed doors. It was a nice lobbying challenge, but it was certainly a challenge. And then cycling, it's just so much nicer and easier. And there's so many different positive resonant aspects of it that you can use from a lobbying perspective. I think that's one of the biggest differences.
Wow, I never would have guessed that plane lash was worse than bike lash.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if plane lash gets quite intense. I haven't encountered so much bike lash. There's very little bike lash in Brussels, at least.
Oh, yeah, there's a lot here in Australia. What do you think the bicycle advocacy world could learn from other industry lobby groups that you've previously worked in?
I think that one of the big advantages for cycling, like I said, is that there are so many arguments that you can use to promote the sector: environment, health, reducing congestion. Not many sectors have this embarrassment of riches when it comes to the arguments that they can make. And I think as a result of that, the cycling industry has kind of divided its message in a lot of different ways. And what it can learn, I think, is that certainly in the current context in Brussels, the big focus is on industrial development. And what traditional trade associations do is they highlight the amount of jobs that they create, they highlight the potential they have to create more jobs, they highlight their industrial footprint. And we need to do more of that. Partially because it's the right time to do it. So we just need to do the classic trade association stuff. And the target that I've set for myself on the team is that politicians, when they think about cycling, first and foremost, they will think about a European industry that has huge potential and is creating lots of jobs. And then only after that, they'll think of all of the other benefits as well. It's about positioning the sector. I think that's something that we can learn from other sectors.
That's interesting because in Australia, our national federated organisation, We Ride Australia, released a report. It was a couple of years ago, wasn't it, Phil? And then it got updated, which basically said that there are more people employed in the bicycle industry in Australia than in the coal industry.
That's good.
Yeah, like it seems quite surprising that that would be the case.
And that's the thing. And that's what we want to move beyond, because people, when they learn about the amount of jobs that we represent and so on, they are pleasantly surprised. But we don't want them to be pleasantly surprised. We want them to know already in advance that, yes, this is a job creation engine.
Yeah, and similarly, that there are more bicycle sales in Australia than car sales, for example. So there are lots of comparisons, but it's really interesting to hear that that's an approach to bring from other industry organisations as well. The ECI signed the European Cyclist Federation manifesto in response to the current oil crisis, calling for immediate actions and reforms, including bike lanes, lowering speed limits, car free days, and promoting bike tourism. Is there a perceived cultural divide between the cycling industry bodies and cycling advocacy bodies, or do you think you're sort of working pretty much in lockstep?
We're working in lockstep. I mean, we have a very fruitful, constructive partnership with ECF. And in fact, last week, by coincidence, we also organized a workshop where we brought all of the civil society organizations together with the industry associations. And we had a workshop on how we can work together to get more results on financial incentives for bike leasing. And there was certainly the experience there that we were bringing two different worlds together, two different approaches, people who work on the basis of principles and a strong ethical focus, and then people on the, let's say, company representation side that are working to achieve principles and are completely devoted to all of the benefits linked with cycling, but who are also very much driven by the need to grow the industry and make their businesses more successful. So bringing those two worlds together was very interesting. But I think that we are working in lockstep, certainly with ECF, and it's just a question of what arguments are needed for the particular moment and what arguments are linked to a particular topic. And so if it's about infrastructure, if it's about use, I think it makes a lot more sense for ECF to take the lead, and then ECI can come in a supporting role and highlight the amount of jobs that will be linked to, for instance, creating more infrastructure. And then on the other hand, if it's a topic linked to industrial development, then ECI should take lead. Very fortunate, but we do really complement each other. And this is something that I haven't seen in any other sector, because usually there is some friction between the users and the producers. But here, by and large, the interests of the users and the producers are aligned, which is essentially just that we all want more cycling.
One thing I must say before we go on is alphabet soup. We've just been talking ECI and ECF. Please explain, as a famous politician here might say, Paul, what do those two things mean?
ECI is European Cycling Industries, the association that represents the manufacturers of bikes and the bike ecosystem. ECF is the European Cycling Federation, representing user groups for cyclists.
Very good. Now, talking about ECI, the group that you lead, when you joined, it was called CIE, and then you merged with something called CONEBI. Can you please explain why you did that, what those first two organisations were, why you merged, and what benefits you hope to get out of it?
Well, I think you already touched on it, Phil. It was the alphabet soup. Too many associations, too many acronyms. We turned two acronyms into one, and that was our effort to make things a bit simpler. But fundamentally, it was about having one voice for the cycling industry. You don't want to have more than one voice going in slightly different directions. That gives politicians the opportunity to play divide and rule with the associations. And it also just makes things easier for politicians, because they just need to have one meeting instead of two. So they had been asking us to get our act together and unite for quite a few years. A lot of the work was done by the time I joined CIE. And so it was relatively straightforward to help putting the two organizations together. And the two organizations complemented each other, because CONEBI was an association for national associations. So the Polish Bike Manufacturers Association, the German Industry Association, and CIE was an association for companies. And they had slightly different flavors. CIE focused more on the ecosystem, all of the innovations around the bike, although they were representing manufacturers as well. And CONEBI was a bit more technical and regulatory, focusing on technical and regulatory legislative changes. I think bringing those two together gives you the best of both worlds in a trade association, and I see my role as trying to maintain the strengths of both organizations in our new association.
Excellent. Best I can tell, more money is spent on bike infrastructure in Europe than any other region in the world. And I'm not trying to put you on the spot and ask for accurate figures, but can you give a broad brush overview in terms of how much, perhaps per year or per funding cycle, has been spent in the past, and what's in the pipeline, what's currently promised through the European Commission and so on in bicycle infrastructure funding?
So this is a topic that's led more by the European Cyclist Federation. So I don't have the numbers to hand at the moment. I just know that we are with ECF, working very hard on what's called the multi-annual financial framework, where all of the opportunities to create funding opportunities for cycling are currently being developed. But I think the biggest part and the most important part of this picture is that the Commission and the European institutions will theoretically unlock opportunities for funding, but that funding won't be used unless there are specific demands from national level. And that's why a big part of our focus, and the focus of ECF as well, is to make sure that user groups are activated at national level, so that politicians are activated at national level to make sure that they are making requests to the funding that is available.
You're in the role, you've been there for a year now. What are your goals as CEO? What are your priorities that you want to achieve through the organisation over the coming years?
Well, one of the first things that I wanted to do was to make sure that we actually had clear priorities. And so that was one of the things that we started with, especially when we're given that we were bringing two associations together, defining no more than 5 priorities and making sure that the members were bought into these. So we had quite a few fun workshops and exercises with all of the members, looking at potential priorities from the point of view of how likely it would be to achieve these priorities and how impactful it would be if we achieve those. So we had this scoring system which made the thing quite objective. And then as a result of that, we identified 5. I can go through them now. Number 1 is to create regulatory certainty for the e-bike. It's probably too loosely defined now in European regulation, and we want to make that a bit more specific, really to protect the e-bike segment. The second part is we need to do a better job on data. Compared to other industries, we are not good enough on having things like data of sales to bike dealers, and then also data of bike dealer sales. And also we need to do a better job of just preparing and presenting, collating information that we can hand over to the European institutions. Number 3, it's about infrastructure, which I think we all accept is the biggest driver of cycling growth. That's done primarily through ECF. Number 4, leasing. So in Europe, we have 2 very clear success stories, one in Germany and one in Belgium. You can deduct the cost of your bike from your gross salary. And in countries where employee taxes are high, it means that you don't really notice the cost of a bike. And so this has been a big driver of both cycling and bike sales in Germany and Belgium. And we think it's unfair that somebody in Spain or Italy or Poland doesn't have the opportunity to avail of this type of an incentive. And we're really focusing on getting these incentives in different European countries. And then number 5, we need to put all of this together and have a clear industry strategy, which is adopted by the European Commission. So the European Commission currently works with a maritime industry strategy, an automobile industry strategy, but there's clearly a need for bicycle industry strategy, which would cover topics like innovation, but also looking at Europe's industrial base and how we can create shorter, more resilient supply chains with more component manufacturing in Europe. So that's our 5th priority. So that's, let's say, all of the specific priorities together. But then on top of that, we need to continue the work that had been done before at CIE and CONEBI in order to raise the visibility of the cycling sector. And it's a very interesting moment because from when I started, we were facing headwinds. The European institutions work with extremes. Under the previous mandate, up until the end of 2024, the huge focus was on the Green Deal, sustainability, what was called Fit for 55. From 2024 onwards, this realization sunk in, partly driven by geopolitical events, that in all of the focus that we had on regulation linked to environmental topics, we were in danger of eroding Europe's industrial base. And so the focus became, okay, we're going to water down all of those environmental regulations and we're going to focus on incentives to really build up European industrial sovereignty. That was the focus, and it has been more challenging to fit the bike industry into that because there's a huge preoccupation there on the car industry. But then just in the past month, 2 months, with an energy crisis looming, politicians are realizing that we need forms of transport that help us achieve energy independence. And so there's a huge opportunity for the bike industry to be more visible again, and we are doing our utmost to capitalize on that.
It's interesting that you mentioned the oil crisis. We were going to ask you about that. We don't normally comment on current affairs in this podcast because of it then dating and who knows what's going to happen tomorrow, let alone next week. But it's such a major issue that we will go there now that you've raised it. And your membership includes most of the world's key bicycle companies. So the first thing I want to ask you is what, if anything, are you hearing from them just in the last month, last few weeks, in terms of any impacts, both positive and negative, so far on their day-to-day business operations?
Yeah, day-to-day business operations, we're working with generally quite long supply chains. components coming from Japan, Vietnam, China, Taiwan. And so obviously this creates pressure on an industry which over the past number of years has already been under a bit of pressure. And so it certainly just underlines the need to consider more resilient supply chains. And so that's what we're doing at the association. It's probably too early to say whether there will be an immediate impact in terms of bike sales. There's already anecdotal evidence that consumers are considering switching to commuting to work with their bike just because of the cost. And I think that obviously makes a lot of sense. Too early to say whether there's an impact there yet on bike sales, but I think that's likely to. So this is going to impact in a negative way and impact in a positive way as well.
Yes, certainly they say never waste a crisis. In the 1970s, the Arab oil embargo was a catalyst for the Netherlands beginning their journey towards prioritizing more cycling, probably much more so than other countries did. And the COVID crisis prompted pop-up cycleways in, I think, something like 650 cities globally. How do you see your organization and others using the current crisis to help further your goals?
Yeah, so first of all, we had a reflection internally about how appropriate it is to be using this crisis. I mean, the first thing to say is that we would prefer if this crisis wasn't there and that there was a bit more geopolitical stability than there currently is. But at the same time, the bike is part of the solution. The bike is part of what's needed to diversify the world's energy mix and to make us less dependent on fossil fuels, which is beneficial from an environmental point of view, but just beneficial from an energy security point of view. That idea wasn't to the front of politicians' minds up until 2 or 3 months ago. Now it is. Now we're very much facing into a potential crisis that could be even more severe than the energy crunch of the early 70s. And we need to absolutely demonstrate that the bicycle is part of the solution. It's a solution that really doesn't cost that much. It's a solution that makes a lot more sense than, for instance, the reduction of VAT on fuel, which might be needed as well. But the more straightforward way is just to look at clear incentives to encourage people to use the bike as opposed to using other forms of transport. We are not a fan of purchase incentives because they're difficult for manufacturers to manage, create inconsistent demand. But what we are very much in favor of is incentives, as I mentioned already, for bike leasing. What's important there is that there's a link between bike leasing and infrastructure. So more funding, more facilitation of better infrastructure, but at the same time, the bike leasing incentives work. And now is the time to really introduce them. And so we will be extremely visible on this. And we have a number of campaigns planned. You gotta be ready to seize a moment like this. It doesn't come around very often. That's the message that I'm sharing with all of our members. Our members are very much ready to go. It's very good timing because we've just from our association's point of view, because we've spent the past year working on internal governance issues and we're really ready to go and now be visible. So we're starting very shortly, like next week, with I Cycle to Work campaign, just highlighting lots of different stories, lots of videos of people cycling to work, lots of videos with politicians cycling to work, just to get that message out there. That's going to build up to World Cycling Day, where we will be encouraging everybody, at least for that day, to cycle to work, talking to all of the companies within our membership and the clients of those companies. So we have a lot of leasing companies who work with BMW and work with big corporate organizations who have bike leasing schemes. So we want to activate and celebrate those, and just to make sure that the conditions are there, because there are lots of barriers, but these easily overcome. So yeah, Sarah, I think is a huge opportunity.
Yeah, it's interesting that, because I think having worked in a couple of different levels of government in Australia when big crises hit, one being the global financial crisis and the other one when COVID came in, the organizations and advocacy groups that are ready to go and are prepared are the ones who end up doing well out of that process. But you have to be ready. You can't just sort of say, oh, something's going to happen now, I hope it goes well. You need to be very, very well prepared for that. Many people would agree that I'm really determined to address gender and diversity on boards, including in the cycling industry. And a glance at the ECI board of directors has, I think, 13 or 14 directors who might be described as male and pale. Is there a plan to try and improve the diversity on your agenda?
Yeah, and I guess the secretariat representative to the board is a bit male and pale. You didn't say stale, so I appreciate that. Yeah.
She was just itching to, but she's just too polite.
Okay. Yeah, no, it's definitely an issue within the sector. So we have a very active women in cycling group commitments. First of all, on panel discussions at events. I think that's where that group really got kicked off. And so we have internal rules to ensure that we have gender diversity at all of our events and all of our panels and so on. We had the discussion about our particular board and whether we would have a specific mandate. And the board decided, well, it was the transition committee at the time. The transition committee decided not to go with a mandate and just leave it up to the democratic process within the organization. This was the result that came from our board elections, which was a reflection of the candidates who applied to be board members. We are open to suggestions for how we improve that, but I don't see a big push yet for there to be mandates on the board. We just need to make sure that it's very clear that we are open to as much gender diversity as possible, that we're open to as much female participation as possible. But I don't think we are ready for mandates yet. But we're open to engage. And like I said, we have our women in cycling group who I think also has raised concerns about gender diversity on our board. I think it's probably fair to say as well that it's a bit of a reflection of, let's say, an issue that is industry-wide. So if you look at top positions within the sector, there's not enough gender diversity there either, and that's something that needs to be addressed too.
Yeah, I can well imagine if the majority of your membership comprises male, it's difficult to get that diversity across the board as well.
Yeah, it's probably more that like the majority of, let's say, executive level, CEO level. Because within, if you go into the working groups, it's a lot more diverse. Go into the associations, it's a lot more diverse. Go into our team, it's 50-50.
So, Paul, you have 11 expert groups covering everything from batteries to bike share, environment, and women in cycling, as you've just mentioned. How proactive is your member participation in these groups, and how well does this system work?
The system is new, and it's a hybrid of the previous two associations. I am really impressed with our member engagement, and I think that it's working really well. So we've had people who succeeded in redefining their job title just so that they could commit something like 80% of their time to bike lobbying through our association. So we have a couple of people in that category. I think people responded really well to the merger, and the lack of clarity around having two associations in the past discouraged people from getting involved, and it wasn't clear, do they need to get involved in CONEBI, CIE, do they need to get involved in both, is that a duplication of efforts? So all of that has been solved now, and so we're really encouraged with the momentum and the enthusiasm from the membership, and just the amount of hours that full-time professionals put into volunteer work that doesn't immediately and directly benefit the bottom line of their company, but will in the long term have a beneficial impact on the industry in general. There's a lot of that type of commitment. And just an example of that is again last week, and you mentioned this to a certain extent, we got a communication from the Commission which was recommending certain measures to address Europe's energy security. Cycling was mentioned quite a few times with some clear recommendations, but of course we needed to do something with that. So it was very easy for us to activate a lot of our members to relay these messages at national level and also promote them and make them more visible on social media and so on. And that's what we need. We're still a fairly small association, and we're up against big vested interests in Brussels, and so we really need all of our members to be active in that. And I think just because it's cycling and because of the real benefits that cycling brings to society, members want to be part of that, want to get involved. So I'm happy with the engagement so far and how all of those different groups are working.
We're coming towards the end of our conversation. Is there anything that we haven't asked you that you wish we had and that you'd like to share?
I am interested in talking about the difference between trade associations and civil society organizations, and the fact that in the past, trade associations in Brussels have been too conservative, and so we're on the back foot with respect to certain policy developments, and how they need to be more nimble, need to be stronger in communications, need to be focused more on setting the general agenda of the Commission rather than just reacting to regulation. Yeah, so I'm interested in talking about that sort of thing.
Well, you've already introduced that subject very well. And I think from your comments throughout this interview, it sounds like you've already forged a very close relationship with the ECF, the European Cyclists Federation. So perhaps you might talk a little bit more about that. And are you actually giving them some money as well as part of this close collaboration?
Yeah, so we make a donation to ECF. I think that's the best way for us to invest resources in infrastructure development. ECF is a big part of that, but I think as well as an industry association, because it's cycling, we have such a huge opportunity to be visible. So I want to take risks on doing more than the traditional thing of just writing a position paper, sending it out and setting up a few meetings. We need to be prepared to be a bit stupid or look a bit extreme for the sake of raising visibility. And I think that we can get away with that because we are cycling. And just two fairly conservative ideas that we'd like to introduce. One, I mentioned it already, I Cycle to Work Day, and I Cycle to Work, just videos with lots of politicians cycling to work, quite important. But then another thing is made in Europe is an important topic for us. It's an important topic in the EU at the moment. We have a significant footprint of bike assembly in Europe. Our members would like to see more manufacturing in Europe, but we just don't, like I said already, want this to be a surprise. So we're going to be organizing a Made in Europe cycling tour where we'll select a number of member states, and somebody on our team is going to cycle to the different factories in those countries and just run social media videos at each of the factories. And also, let's say, cycle to one factory, get a bike from that factory, and then cycle to another one, and then do social media about the bike, about the factory, and about the industry footprint in that country. It's really exciting because we've really opportunities to be visible in these sort of less conventional ways, at least for a trade association.
Well, we'd expect nothing less from an Irishman to be so radical. So that's very encouraging. And I know you met with Sarah's approval with those comments. Sarah, is there anything you would like to add or ask before we finish this interview?
No, I think it's really fantastic to hear you talk about how that sort of relationship between the trade associations and civil society works, because I think I've seen that that's where it's the most effective. And I've seen other organisations going through a similar process here in Australia. So, for example, the Transport Professionals Association is one organisation that I'm a member of it's doing exactly that, sort of saying, well, actually, we can and should have policy positions, and we should do continuing professional development training, for example. So it's interesting to seeing that switching across the different industries as well.
Well, Paul Walsh, thanks for squeaking.
Thanks very much, Phil. Thanks, Sarah.
Well, I thought Paul had a great sense of humour. You expect nothing less from an Irishman. But what did you think of that conversation, Sarah?
Yes, Paul does have a great sense of humour, which made it super fun to interview him. It was really fascinating to hear these organisations, ECI and ECF, representing the industry and advocacy respectively. The fact that they're working so closely together to advocate for better cycling conditions was really interesting, and that they're gearing up during this oil crisis with a clear set of priorities and recommendations that they're taking to the European Commission and others was really heartening to hear.
Yeah, we will also in the show notes put the manifesto, if you like, the ECF have written, which Paul's organisation has signed on to. So we'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. But I thought it was a great conversation too. Now we'll move to the last section that we have in every podcast called What's Up. This is where we try to update you if we've been doing anything, seeing anything that might be of interest or any place we might be going. What's up, Sarah?
Well, a few things I'm noticing is that with the oil crisis in full swing, I'm seeing a lot more people out riding, particularly on shared bikes such as Lime bikes. And I don't know whether that's because I'm in Sydney and there's now a whole new suite of cycling infrastructure. So the Oxford Street Cycleway has just opened that links from Taylor Square right through into the heart of the CBD in Sydney and College Street and so on. So we're seeing a really big increase in riders because of that infrastructure. But I also wonder how much people are switching because their other costs of travel are so high. My estimation is that up to half of the riders that I'm seeing heading into and out of the city are on share bikes. And it's just fascinating to see that pan out. And I'm curious how it will evolve over the next few months if the crisis continues for an extended period. And I hope it basically results in more investment in safe infrastructure.
Well, share bikes are growing globally. If you look at the data, Lime in particular, I reckon I'll buy shares in that when they float, because they've got $1 billion, I think, US in revenue now a year, Lime. Could be wrong on that, but I think that's what I read a few months ago. So the whole bike share ecosystem is really growing strongly.
The other thing, I was talking to someone from the city of Sydney the other day who said that the statistics they're being told about the number of riders, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but it was something like 8,000 a day up to 21,000 a day in the last 3 or 4 months. So it's seeing an astronomical growth in the number of people on share bikes just since the oil crisis started.
Indeed. Anything else for your What's Up, Sarah?
No, that's all for today.
Well, it segues beautifully into what I was going to say, because I listened to a really good podcast the other day, the Micromobility podcast, which is hosted by Prabin Joel-Jones, who actually coincidentally also lives in Brussels and runs the Micromobility Conference, which I was lucky enough to attend in Brussels last year. And he was talking about the massive growth of shared mobility in Chicago. It's easy to think in this age of Mr. Trump that anything active transport related would be an absolute basket case in America at the moment and might have its funding completely cut. But of course, they've got multiple levels of government there. And this is something done at the city level. And there was an excellent interview with the Assistant Commissioner of CDOT, the Chicago Department of Transportation. His name was David Powell. Well worth a listen. And he's a guy who is in a senior role but doesn't own a car, very hardcore bike advocate, if you like, who's inside the tent. And he was talking about Chicago bike share. They have a thing called Divvy bikes, which they've had for quite a few years. Back in the day, I used to publish cycling guidebooks for cities in America. So I visited Chicago multiple times, meeting with our local author and so on. And Divvy Bike was just getting underway then, but it's much, much expanded now. Divvy Bike is actually owned by the city. This is their dock bike share schemes, not unlike the City Bike in New York or the Santander bikes, commonly called the Boris bikes in London, or the Veilib in Paris or whatever. But also, like in Sydney and like in many other cities around the world, Lime have come into Chicago and have grown from something like 100,000 a few years ago rides a year to 6 million rides a year. And meanwhile, Divvy is up to 6 million odd. Double check all those numbers. Listen to the podcast if you want the exact numbers, but it was something like 12 million rides a year, which is a lot. I think that the whole bike share, scooter share has really got a lot of upside to go. And one interesting thing about Chicago, though, that is really holding them back, in 2008, the then mayor, whose name was Mayor Richard Daley, sold their entire city's on-street parking rights to a private consortium, half of which ironically was a Middle Eastern oil sovereign wealth fund. And he sold 36,000 metered parking spaces for 75 years for $1.5 billion US. As is often the case in Chicago, they were broke at the time and needed the money. But that meant that they sold all control over those meters for 75 years. And ironically, the contract was totally stitched up in favour of the commercial buyers. And so now the city has to pay huge compensation, even if they want to remove a single car park space. So, for example, if they want to put a protected bike lane in that might require moving or removing 100 metered parking spaces, that will cost them a fortune. And in fact, even temporary closures, like if they want to have a street festival or something, they have to pay the private operators for their lost revenue. And this is not token amounts. We're talking actual money paid so far under this lemon of a contract has been $160+ million that the city of Chicago has had to pay out in compensation anytime they want to dare close a parking space for any reason. It's an unbelievable deal. And in fact, they've that company that paid the $1.15 billion recently sold the rights. They had the rights under the terrible contract to on-sell the rights to the highest bidder, and they sold to another private organisation for $3 billion. So you couldn't write a script like that, Sarah. Have you heard of that before?
No, I had absolutely no idea. That sounds pretty crazy to me.
It's unbelievable. Even by American standards, it's renowned as one of the worst deals that any city has made. If any city officials are listening to that, please don't sell your parking meter rights. Meanwhile, we're coming to the end of the podcast. Any final words from you, Sarah?
Yeah, I guess for anyone listening to this podcast who is really eager to have safer infrastructure in your local area, and that's whether it's on your own bike or on a shared bike, I highly recommend that you join an advocacy organisation like your state Bike Advocacy or Better Streets. And you don't have to attend protests or write letters. Simply subscribing and supporting them helps to grow their membership base and helps them to build the numbers behind getting politicians and bureaucracies to provide more funding for cycling infrastructure. So that would be my recommendation of the month.
I could not agree more, Sarah. And I know we've had at least one listener from 40 or more countries. So wherever you are in the world, I don't think there's a single country that doesn't have some sort of advocacy organisation that you could join. So just find out and join it. Multiple politicians have told me over the years that pressure, that groundswell helps them. It gives them cover. So it's a really good thing that you could do. So that's all for this month's Squeaky Wheel podcast. Until next month, keep squeaking.